So my talk is about, as Michaela said, diversity of aging in the territories of the European Union. And although this is not exactly the theme of the conference, which is looking at depopulation, you have seen from yesterday's discussion, from Vice President Switcha's presentation, and from the presentation in different sessions that it's very much related. The research that I'm going to present today is emerging from a report that we published earlier this year, which was called The Demographic Landscape of EU Territories. And it's the work of not only of myself, but of many of my colleagues that work at GRC. And just I wanted to acknowledge them on this slide. I have structured the presentation along the following topics. I will first provide some framework and some literature. Then I will present some of the findings about the geographical patterns of aging at spatial level in the recent past, with some projections to 2050. And then we will zoom out at NUTS3 level to disentangle the changes that are due to cohort turnover from those due to net migration, and then move on to the impacts on access to services and amenities, on the economy, on electoral behavior and political impact. And to conclude, and if I have some time, which my presentation is quite dense, we will go and have a look at the Atlas of Demography, a new visualization tool that has been developed here at the GRC. So the framework is, and as you've seen yesterday from the talk of Vice President Switcha, is very much related to the new Commission's portfolio on demography and democracy. And since Ursula von der Leyen took over the presidency of the European Union, you've seen that demography is very high, actually, on the political agenda of the European Commission. So the presentation that I'm doing here is very linked to different exercises that I've listed here, and that was also mentioned yesterday. The report on the impact of demographic change, the green paper on aging. A green paper is actually a document published by the Commission to stimulate discussion on a given topic, and the long-term vision for rural areas, and there are many more to come into the future. The aim of the research is, as I said, to look at territorial diversity into the present, into the future. It is using a database that has been produced at GRC on population information by age at very high resolution, and to analyze the drivers, as mentioned before. So the added value is this geographical level that allows us to analyze through time highly detailed data at grid cell level, municipalities, and regional level. Just to have a quick look at the literature, which has shown the existence of multiple realities at the local level, most of the findings, most of the output of this literature is that the dynamics, that the realities at the local level are dynamic and in time and over the life course of individual. Generally, what we've seen is the Second World War. Rural areas have been losing population to urban areas. With a reverse trend towards suburbs and peripheries in the 1970s. And these movements have been responsible for depopulation in some areas with reinforcing mechanism that you can see on these little infographics, where you have the positive reinforcing mechanism that create more population when activities remain in a region, or in the inner circle of this infographic, where you see the depopulation and reinforcing mechanism that can happen. In terms of the literature, there are many studies that look, when looking at spatial aging literature, that look at the phenomenon of segregation, whether elderly are segregated, also on the quality of life of this elderly, with mixed findings. Sometimes you see more segregation. in rural areas or in urban areas, for instance, or quality of life is the same. But the literature that looks at spatial analysis of migration and aging is closer to what we do here in this work, basically investigating what is the impact of migration mobility, which is typically age specific. And for instance, like Gregory and Patuelli show how migration can trigger a self-reinforcing process, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Similarly, Kaczynski et al. In 2020 show that the disparities in population by age at NUTS2, so these are provinces, big regions, are not really necessarily related to the fact that both regions are primarily urban or rural areas, but more whether they are losing or gaining population. And this is exactly what we show, but at a higher resolution level. And then there's quite a lot of literature on the impact of this aging that we see at the local level. One is on the accessibility and availability of services and whether these services are matching the presence of elderly at the local level and with the infrastructure that is required for the needs of the elderly population. This is also linked to the sustainability of those infrastructure that is very important and that will require a continuous flow of population. There's also quite some literature on the polarization of the elderly, which was highly visible, as you remember, during the US election that led to the election of Trump or to the Brexit referendum. So if this population is concentrated territorially, it can have consequences on the contract between a generation, and it's particularly important. I mean, its influence could be decisive, how it could slow down some transformations that are needed, for instance, regarding climate change, adaptation to climate change and measures that should be taken to fight climate change or to change the welfare system, for instance. A large part of the literature is also looking at economic growth and the impact of aging at local level on the economic growth of the territories. And most point at a negative impact on productivity when the share of elderly workers is higher. Other points at the opportunities that are coming from the silver economy that can be conducive to economic growth in some territories, in some regions and some areas. Now, let's get to the work that we did, where we looked at geographical patterns of aging, and you can see here on the map what the resolution level that we use. So we have information about the age distribution at 1 kilometer grid cell level from 2011 to 2050. So the methodology, I won't dwell into it, but in a nutshell, what we do is we take the 2001 round censuses at municipal level and downscale that to 1 kilometer grid cells by age, and using iterative proportional fitting method, then we make them, I mean, we generate grid maps that are consistent both with these ENACT, so this enhancing activity and population mapping grid map, which is produced also at GRC, and with the age distribution being fitting the municipal population level by age. This is for 2011, and then for the period from 2012 to 2050, we use projections of Eurostat. We use the Europop 2013 in this presentation. This is being updated with the most recent Europop 2019, but at that time, when we produced the report, it was not yet available. And these are also downscaled using the Louisa model that is produced at GRC in another knowledge center on territorial policies. So what are the results of this? On the left graph, you see the medians of the share of elderly across some 100,000 of local administrative units, which are like municipalities that are grouped using different degrees of urbanization. So you have cities, town, and then rural areas. The evidence points at a difference in levels of aging across this degree of urbanization. So it goes from 20% for cities to 23% in rural areas. And you can see on the right-hand graph how this is going to change in the future, going to 2050. And first, the share of elderly would be increasing about everywhere in all areas, whether they are city, towns, or rural areas. In rural areas, it would increase from 19% in 2011, sorry, to 30% in 2050, and in cities from 15% to 27% in 2050. And this is one of the, I mean, it's not revolutionary, but this is one important conclusion of the report, because it has implication for the policy, is that aging does not only happen in the rural world, and it will happen similarly in the context of urban and semi-urban areas, and also at the same pace as projected. So this is quite important for the policy work of the European Commission. There is, of course, quite some diversity at the level of EU member states, as you can see on this graph, which is showing on the x-axis the share of elderly in the cities, and on the y-axis the share of elderly in rural areas. And all the countries that are above the diagonal have a higher share of elderly in rural areas. And this is very high in, for instance, in Spain and in Portugal. For some other countries, at different level of aging, you have about the same shares. It's the case of Germany, that has a very high share of elderly, and also in the case of Ireland, where the share of elderly in both typology is lower. And from other countries like Slovakia, Slovenia, Malta, and Poland, there are more elderly living in cities than in rural areas. The fact that the gap between urban and rural area is not expected to expand is clear from the right-hand graph. When we look at the difference between the difference between the percentage point difference, sorry, between the share of elderly in rural areas and in 2020, and between the share of elderly in 2020 and 2050 in urban and rural areas. And when you see that the little square, which represents the data for 2050, is almost always below that value in 2020. Only for a few countries like Germany and Denmark, the difference would increase. For many other countries, other members, the gap would get smaller or reverse, with cities having a higher share of elderly actually compared to rural areas, like in Romania, Cyprus, or Greece. So these patterns show that urban-rural patterns do not actually explain everything. And this is what we show actually in this next graph, which is showing the share in the proportion of the elderly in local administrative units. So in these 100,000 municipalities, with the level compared to the level in 2011. And these different territories are grouped in both experiencing an increase and those at experiencing a decrease in population. And what we see, and of course these are projections, so these are based on what if scenario, but basically both areas, according to these scenarios, would experience an increase compared to 2011, but the increase would be higher in areas that experience a decrease of population compared to areas that experience an increase of population. So this is where exactly the policy should look at. These patterns can be in part explained by mobility over the life course. And in this graph, for instance, we look at the proportion of elderly and children and adolescents, so below the age of 20, and how they are changing in 1 kilometer square cell along continuous gradients of distance from the closest functional areas, from the city center on the left-hand side graph, and in terms of density on the right graph. And as expected, the share of elderly increases consistently and regularly with distance from the city centers, and it declines regularly also along the density. And this is at the European Union level, I forgot to say. The pattern is not so linear for children, but all these patterns, as I said, are really linked to the mobility over the life course, following patterns of employment, suburbanization, mobility to rural areas for all the age groups. And they are, of course, they differ a lot between countries, but these trends can really reinforce a positive or a negative cycle of population change. I will skip this graph, and let's move to what are the drivers, and the drivers of changes at the local level. And here, first of all, I zoom on the period 2015 to 2019, and we scale up to the research to nuts-free level, which has like regional level. And we're trying to see what is the disentangle, what is the effect of cohort change versus migration, and what impact it has on the size of the working age populations. We used for that the work of de Beer et al. That was published in 2011. And we relate net migration to changes in the size of the working age population, and difference, I mean, having mortality, of course, but also the difference between the entry cohorts, the 15-19, and the exit cohort, the 60-64. Of course, there are many problems with this equation. We have net migration as a residual. We don't have any information on what are the flows that are behind this net migration. And we don't know either, of course, whether these flows are from interregional migration or international migration. Nevertheless, I think some results can be, some findings are interesting from these. So on these maps, you see the change in the working age population and in net migration and in cohort turnover between the period 2015 to 2019. So it's a small, it's a short window of that we are looking at. What we see is that most territories, and it's like more than 60% of territories, are actually experiencing negative cohort effects, coupled with what you see in the middle graph, positive net migration effect. In most cases, if you see on the left-hand side map, is that this net migration is not enough to compensate for the decline in working age population. Actually, it's only in 27% of territories was migration able to compensate for the loss in cohort. And this was mostly the case in territories, in regions located in Germany, in Austria, Sweden, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The second largest of countries that is quite visible on this map were EU territories that experience both net negative migration and cohort turnover effect. And they are approximately 23% of all territories, and they are mostly distributed across Eastern and Central EU member states, such as Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, and also the Balkans, South and Southeastern EU member states, such as Croatia, Greece, and also Italy. These last territories are logically showing a pattern of decline of their working age population. We refined further by looking at differentials by place of residence, distinguishing between urban, rural, and intermediate areas. And what we see is that during 2015-2019, on average, the size of the working age population decreased in rural and intermediate areas by -3% for rural areas and -1% for intermediate areas, whereas it increased in urban areas by almost 1%. There are a few rare cases of rural areas with a growth of their working age population, and they are mostly located in Austria, Belgium, and Sweden. And these are interesting cases that would require further analysis to understand how these member states were able to retain population in their rural areas. So what we see here, like going very quickly, is that overall positive net migration was more able to protect urban and intermediate areas from further shrinkage of labor force supply compared to rural areas. And as we mentioned before, mobility has a strong impact and sometimes a reinforcing impact on patterns of aging. And this can be quite different across countries. If we look at the net migration rates across this period for two countries, we see that in Italy, there's quite some mobility from the south going to the north of a country. And in Germany, you can see this from the east going to the west and to the south of the country. And these patterns, of course, have a strong strong reinforcing effect. Now we'll move to the last part of my talk, which is about the impact that it can have, and we'll look at several impacts. One of the impact is to look at the accessibility to services and urban amenities, differentiating between different types of services at local level, whether they are local services, sub-regional services, and regional services. And on these two graphs, you see the road distance and the percentage population with a certain distance to a service. At first glance, there seems to be very little difference between the two age group. Overall, still it's visible that compared to rural areas, cities, towns, and suburbs provide better accessibility for all age group to generic services, regardless of the geographic scope of the service provided. But it's when the most of the difference is actually for the elderly that are living and that experience slightly more distances to services, that are living in mostly inhabited areas and dispersed rural areas where the resident population is sparsely distributed, which could be problematic, especially for the elderly. The second impact that we look at is that of aging in the context, territorial aging in the context of economic growth. And there will be more talk about this today at the conference, I'm aware. So as I said before, most of the literature points at the negative impact of aging on economic growth. From a descriptive point of view, if we compare the map that is showing the GDP per capita and the old age dependency ratio, it seems strangely unrelated, as we see the highest GDP are in Central and Western Europe, in Central and Northern Europe, and with the lowest in Eastern and Southern Europe, and reversely, the old age dependency ratio is lowest in Eastern Europe and some regions of France and Germany, and highest in Northern Europe. So to be less descriptive, we performed the regression analysis looking at several indicators. And here I show the result for a dependent variable being the GDP per capita, and looking at different characteristics of this NUTS3 region in terms of share of the population in the working age population by different age groups and other characteristics. So on this graph, the marker shows the estimated coefficient, and the horizontal line shows the confidence interval. What we see here is that regions with a higher share of population, age 45-54 in the working age population in the total sample, seem to have a higher GDP per capita. If we go into finer, we see that there is a considerable heterogeneity among the region subgroups. So in regions that experience population growth and that might be contributed by migration, the association is actually positive and significant for the three broad age group, basically from the age of 35 to the age of 64. On the contrary, with negative population growth and negative net migration, the effect, and this is the other side of the y-axis, the effect of a share of a group is actually negative. When we look at the degree of urbanization, the relationship also shows positive with age for urban and intermediate areas and negative for rural areas, particularly for the age group 45-54. I'm not going to go, in the interest of time, to go into more detail concerning what is the impact of what changes with old age dependency ratio or economic diversity in employment structure and TFR, but all of them somehow contribute potentially to mitigate the economic consequences of an aging population. Now, the last impact that we consider in this report is that of political attitudes and behavior. And we looked at different parameters, opinions, for instance, toward the EU or national government, and based on the Eurobarometer data, and voting behavior for parties, for instance, with strong stances on some issues. Well, one summary of a result is that the divide in voting and attitudes toward the EU and also immigration depends basically on the interaction between age and place of residence. So it's not one or the other, it's the interaction both. For instance, if we look at the graph which shows the proportion of respondents with trust in the EU, you see that at young ages, there is quite a difference in trust in the EU, which overall diminishes with age, but it seems very different for different age group, as the difference to be very marginal for the elderly population compared to the youth population. We see when we look at voting behavior, and this is in the framework of a European parliamentary election, we see when we look at the median age of those who vote for political parties that have critical stances regarding the EU, and this is again at NUTS3 level, so each dot on this graph represents a NUTS3 level. The figures show basically two diverging trends depending on the level of urbanization. So in rural areas, as the median age increase, the proportion of votes for parties that have a critical stance again towards the EU increases. The same is true for people who live in intermediate areas, although the distribution of dots here is more sparse. In urban areas, the trend is almost flat, so there's no increase in critical view towards the EU when the median age increases. But also here you see that the dots are basically all over the place. So we do this for, actually the authors do that for different issues, and one of the main conclusions is that the age divides appear to be very issue dependent, so depending on the different issues. So now I'm coming to my conclusions. I hope I'm doing well with time. Aging is more associated to depopulation, which is rightly the theme of this conference, than to rural or remote areas. It is shaped by migration and residential preferences over the life course. In some regions, migration is able to compensate for the deficit, but in cohort turnover, and that can lead to increasing in the working age population, but in most regions, actually, it's not able to compensate. Aging is affecting GDP per capita in a non-linear way. And we see that in some areas that are depopulating, in rural areas, a young population is not always a prerequisite for economic performance. In terms of political behavior, we see that in rural areas, aging is interacting with a local context in determining divides in attitudes and political positioning versus the EU and other issues. So in terms of policies, of course, policies, and especially policies at the European level, cannot offset the macro regional trends of aging. But for sure, the cohesion, urban and rural policies can respond to the specific needs of diversely aging regions, and whether they are in urban or in rural territories. And these policy interventions will be essential to avoid a widening of political and socioeconomic divides in the EU. We've seen this territorial, the importance of territorial differences in, for instance, in the spread of COVID-19 virus. I'm sorry, we always have to go back to COVID-19 in whatever we do. And we saw, like, especially at the beginning, that at the beginning of the epidemic, in the first 10 days of the epidemic, in the first wave in 2020 in Europe, there was a huge differential between the contamination rates of the R0, the reproduction number, sorry, between urban and rural areas. This has changed over the course, and it has changed in the next wave. And if you want to know more, I have a presentation about that at the IUSSP next week. Just a small advertisement at 5 o'clock in the morning. On the...
Can you wrap up? Because
I wrap up. It's just the last slide, the last two slides. So all of this data that I've presented at the European level and to the local dimension are in the Atlas of Demography. So just put Atlas of Demography GRC in your search engine, and you will find it. And some of them are detailed into stories that are also stemming from the report. This will be updated. There will be new stories, new data coming. But for what I presented, you can actually go to different regions and see what is happening on this region at NUTS3 level, and also at grid cell level. I will stop here. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.